So, a few of our listeners wanted to know what my thoughts were on affirmations. And my perspective is that it isn't enough to say affirmations. I mean, what's the point of saying them if it's not how we truly feel inside? If we say them without believing that what we're affirming is true, I mean, they just simply become words. It is my belief that it's better to become everything that you want to embody about affirmations. It's better to be the person that we would like to be, not just sound like the person that we want to be. I mean, if we identified the reason why we needed affirmations in the first place, there would be no reason for us to use them. I mean, needing to affirm something that we don't really feel encompasses a type of doubt. Needing an affirmation to validate how you feel reflects doubt. The assurance reflects doubt. I mean, you don't need words to validate your divinity. In the end, words are just words. So instead of saying affirmations, I would recommend just being the person that you want to be by exploring whatever is preventing you from feeling whole. You don't need the approval of affirmations to constantly remind you of your worth. I mean, you're already the most beautiful fucking creation there is. I mean, all we need to do is really just stop pretending that we aren't. I mean, the reason that we use affirmations is because our words are always working collaboratively with the imagery of the mind. And anything that we say produces a type of data set of images relative to the words that we use. So when we say that we're happy, our ego sort of scours the mind looking for imagery correlated with the times in which we were happy. I mean, we all know how strong the mind is. It'll show you all the best stuff first. But the imagery isn't the most integral part. What's powerful about the imagery is the sort of emotional charge and imprint it leaves on us and our bodies and our spirits. So imagine saying an affirmation, and in an instant, your body and your mind and your spirit all assimilate the sort of emotional charge of that happiness. That's what we want to manifest, right? And we do it by familiarizing ourselves with the feeling of happiness. But it can't be a manufactured happiness. But the thing that we often miss about all of this is that we don't really need to remember what it's like to be happy. I mean, we don't need to visualize being a good person. In fact, I think the reason we feel like we aren't is because we constantly set these standards for ourselves of what it means to be a good person. And typically they aren't practical. And when we don't meet these requirements, we feel even worse. I mean, what is a good person? And who told you that you needed to be one? Of course, that doesn't mean that you should be a bad person, but my point is maybe it's these ideas that are causing these sort of feelings of lack in us. Because when we say that we want to be a better person, we usually have very impossible and romantic ideas of what that means. I mean, if we go a step further with an affirmation and say, I am a good person, I mean, who are you trying to convince? Yourself? I mean, who told you that you aren't a good person? And if somebody did actually tell you that, I mean, why would you believe them? Of course, that doesn't mean that we should carry on hurting others or not treating others fairly. I mean, it's true. People sometimes do bad things, but that doesn't mean that they're collectively bad people. I would say that the reason, good people fall victim to this idea of being a bad person is because they sort of overly identify with the bad things that they sometimes do. I mean, we make one simple mistake and the ego sort of intervenes and starts trying to convince you of how much you suck. I mean, in some cases, maybe we do, but that isn't enough to say that we're an all caps sort of bad person. Now, I'm not talking about people out there that are deliberately hurting others. I mean, that's a different thing. I'm talking about people in this spiritual community that are convinced that they aren't good enough because someone along the line in their life somehow convinced them that they're not. I'm here to tell you that that's just not true, right? And we don't really need an affirmation to convince you that it isn't. So the reason people fall into these feelings of inadequacy has really more to do with the type of misidentification with self. It's more to do with that than it does the actual sort of product of what comes as a result of our negative actions towards ourselves or others. I mean, the ego or the mind is an extremely strong tool, and it will try and convince you that you are things that you wouldn't even imagine that you are. I mean, our minds judge us way more than our worst enemies ever could because it knows everything about us. It knows our weaknesses, our fears, our hopes, our dreams. And one would think that our own mind would choose a side at some point in the game, but the ego is not in the business of being good. I mean, it's not even in the business of being bad. It's in the business of surviving. It's in the business of making absolutely sure that you depend on it for everything. And this includes your happiness and your pain. The ego doesn't seem to work within a sort of moral compass. That's the spirit's job. The ego sort of works within the realm of duality and survival. And the only way for the ego really to survive is just to make absolutely sure that you're constantly chasing ideas and memories and feelings and emotions and dreams. And whether these feelings bring joy or unbelievable pain really makes no difference to the ego. It will make sure that you feel all of it because the ego is sort of like this muscle that likes to be exercised. And we all know what happens when we exercise muscles, right? They get stronger. And the ego sort of like exemplifies this strength by slowly trying to convince you that it is you. And eventually, you won't even be able to tell the difference between what you are and what you're not. You'll go around confidently telling others that you're the baddest motherfucker that ever lived because you have millions of dollars and 5 cars and 1 million followers and an image so grandiose, you won't even realize that you're being used by your own ego. I mean, you won't even realize how much you're deeply fractured inside. I mean, narcissism is a perfect example of how this plays out. You see, all we're doing when we call ourselves certain things is we're identifying with ideas, right? We're identifying with a certain philosophy we have over the experiences that we've been through. And then we're saying, look, this is me. This is you. You're an asshole. You're beautiful. You're clever. You're shy, And as simple as a statement it can be to either sort of criticize someone or compliment someone in the wrong hands, in the hands of the ego, for example, we can either start wars with ourselves and attempt to deny our negative judgments of ourselves, or we can start a war with ourselves trying to sustain this feeling we have of being perfect. And this is due to a type of misidentification with the self and ego. And we have to sort of unfuck our minds by realizing that what we are can never accurately be defined or characterized by thoughts or images or words or, I mean, even feelings. And so it's important to realize how ephemeral it all is. So the great Harvard professor, Richard Alpert, set off on this quest to become one of the greatest clinical psychologists in his field. And that's who he believed he was, up until this sort of introduction of psychedelic in the 60s, which completely sort of altered the trajectory of his work, by the way. And it sort of led him to India, where he sat at the feet of his guru, Maharaji Ji, and he returned from that experience as the great spiritual teacher we all know as Ram Dass. And I'm sure no one in Harvard saw that one coming. And, when he returned, I mean, not even his father was convinced of this new sort of persona that he brought back with him. Because in his father's mind, he was still the Harvard professor, Richard Alpert. But going even further than that, I mean, Ram Dass amassed thousands of followers on the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment. He sort of self-actualized this image of being a spiritual teacher. And rightly so. I mean, he was one of the most prolific and profound teachers of our time. But that's who he was. And he embodied this role with unbelievable grace. And he often even acknowledged that it was simply a role that he was playing. And what he meant by role is that he understood that it was just something that wouldn't last forever and that it was something that just so could easily change. And for him, in his case, it did. I mean, and more so for us, because in 1997, he had a stroke. And the person that we all previously knew as Ram Dass changed almost instantly in what seemed to be overnight. I mean, a man that gave 2-hour-long lectures on the nature of consciousness just suddenly became a man unable to articulate his words or even speak publicly in the same way. And there was really no one, no one that saw that coming. And so why is this important? Well, because Ram Dass became a living embodiment of his practice. And that practice was detachment from identification with forms and roles, realizing that life has changed. And despite the body that changes, there's still something inside that remains the same, right? So he was a living embodiment of that teaching. So look, you can say that you're any number of things. You can say you're happy, you're sad, you're a bad person. You can call yourself a healer, a businessman, a beautiful person. And we can live our lives just under this assumption that this is who we are up until the moment that it all just falls apart right before our very eyes. I mean, I don't mean this to sound negative because it's not. The only negative thing about it is when we limit the expanse of our spirit with roles that we know will change at some point, because our identification with roles leaves us sort of vulnerable to the pain that occurs when we can't fulfill those roles in the way that we expect to. I mean, not to mention the pain that we feel when we've invested so much of our energy into these roles only to have them fall apart or change in the event something bad happens, like maybe like a pandemic, for example. I mean, why would we want to be thrown around like this? My point is this. So, affirmations are useful, but only when we're aware of who or what inside is actually listening. I mean, we can use affirmations as a way to anchor our awareness into the love and magnificence of our own being, or we can use affirmations as a way to convince our ego of a worth that we know it doesn't have the capacity to handle in a humble way. I mean, all that will happen is that you'll perpetually try and convince yourself of something you don't really feel, but you'll still choose to believe it. And you will act like you're the happiest, most abundant person in the world, yet you'll still feel enormous amounts of insecurity because, as much as you want to manifest a better you, it's still coming from a place of lack. And this insecurity will show its face in your life as narcissism, pretentiousness, and anger. Because as much as you say or act like you're the coolest motherfucker that ever lived, you know in your heart it isn't coming from a pure place. So until you find the core reason of why you need affirmations in the first place, I mean, this will always be the case. Because in order for affirmations to work, we need to have enough wisdom to know what is real and what isn't, right? So, what is real is the love that we have inside, sort of waiting for us to awaken to it. What isn't real are words used to hype us into thinking and believing that we're someone that we're not. I mean, in my opinion, it's better to think of affirmations as reminders pointing us in the direction of a type of superpower that we all know that we have, and that's love. And instead of sort of operating from an identity we create for ourselves, instead of trying to manifest abundance from an identity that we create for ourselves, we instead manifest abundance solely from a place of love. And then we work from there. I mean, you can call yourself a magnificent, beautiful flower all day long, but if there isn't love backed behind those words, all you'll do is create a conceptual self and work tirelessly to protect that conceptual image that you've created. And trust me, I mean, you can drive yourself into the fucking ground trying to make that stick. I mean, in my perspective, it is better to work from love and just start from there. And at some point, we may say or say to ourselves, well, I don't feel like a loving person. And I would say every human being on this planet has the capacity to love. The issue isn't that you aren't loving. The issue is that you've developed reasons to believe that you're not. And those reasons are sort of powering our ship, right? So for affirmations to work, we need to figure out the reason we need them in the first place. And the reason usually comes down to a lack of self-love and issues of self-worth. I mean, this is what I would encourage anyone to focus on first. If we can tackle that, then affirmations can be an extremely powerful tool to help remind us of this self-actualized love that we all have as humans. I mean, the last thing that we want to do is use affirmations as a way to validate what we don't feel, because the only force inside that needs validation is the ego. The spirit doesn't require any type of validation. At the most fundamental level, we don't need to acquire love because the spirit is fundamentally made up of this love. I mean, it can never not be loving because it's sort of intrinsically what we are. It's really only a question of whether you're aware of it. So, operating purely from love, I just wanted to say this. So, operating purely from love won't automatically equate to wealth or success or power in the way that you want it to or in the way that you think. But it'll be a much more pure and holistic way to begin your process and obtaining it. Because even if you don't end up being successful or wealthy, you'll still have something that no one can ever take from you. And that is this love we have for ourselves, right? For being alive. Now, this doesn't mean to just simply go around acting like you love yourself. I mean, loving yourself isn't as simple as just believing it. That's what narcissists do. Loving ourselves is really a simple awareness of what self is and what self isn't. And the best way to tell if we're coming from a loving place is that everything we say or do becomes beautiful. It becomes compassionate. It becomes caring towards others. So there's this story. Someone once asked Muji, how do I know if what is speaking inside is ego or spirit? And he said, you'll know because its energy is beautiful and it will sound like poetry. I mean, you'll know because it doesn't ask for anything. So, have you ever heard a song so beautiful that it invoked feelings of beauty and love in you? Have you ever watched like a sunset in awe of how majestic and mysterious it was? Or that feeling that you had in your heart the first time you kissed the love of your life? That feeling, that feeling is you. And the journey in life is figuring out a way to bring that feeling into everything you say and do in your life.